Welcome to the debate. Usually when you look at satellite imagery of a desert, the boundary between sand and civilization is, well, it's stark. It is almost completely binary. You have the beige of the dunes, a very sharp line, and then the deep green of an irrigated valley.
Right. It's nature's immutable barrier. You don't naturally see a gradient there. It just stops.
Exactly. It just stops. But if you look at the map of Egypt over the last decade, that sharp line is actively blurring. The green is pushing aggressively into the beige. We are looking at a physical landscape that is like rewriting its own boundaries through sheer engineering and investment.
And massive capital, yeah.
That is the big question.
Right. And I look at the data and I see a structural triumph. I see a country that has built an adaptable, highly lucrative export engine out of thin air and sand. See, I look at the exact same data and I see incredible fragility. The top-line revenue, the billions they are bringing in, is undeniably impressive. But underneath that, the model relies on pushing raw volume over processed value, and it is on a direct collision course with severe natural resource constraints that you simply cannot engineer your way out of.
Well, let's get into the mechanics of this because I want to start by appreciating the sheer physical scale of what is happening on the ground. From my perspective, we are witnessing a near-miraculous economic expansion. Over the last decade, they've taken agriculture from a traditional, somewhat localized sector and forged it into an organized, aggressive export industry.
One that's growing at what, 8% annually?
8% annually? Yeah. Between 2014 and 2024, Egypt reclaimed over 3 million fedans in massive desert projects like Toshka, the New Delta, and East Owena.
And just a pause there for clarity, because the terminology really matters. A fedan is the standard unit of land measurement in Egypt. It's roughly equivalent to 1.038 acres.
Right, so we are talking about roughly 3.1 million acres of pure desert transformed into arable land. That took their total agricultural footprint from under 8.5 million fedans to, roughly 9.7 million. That is a 15% increase in total agricultural land in just 10 years.
It is a massive physical shift, absolutely.
And the export volume mirrors this explosion perfectly. They grew fresh exports by nearly 60%, jumping from 4.1 million tons in 2014 to approaching 7 million tons today. But my argument isn't just about moving dirt and pumping water. It's about strategic execution. The fact that Egypt is now the undisputed #1 global exporter of fresh oranges proves that this isn't an accident.
#1, yeah. But at what cost?
Well, it is a highly competitive, structural victory. And it's backed by billions invested in new agricultural roads, modern packing stations, and precision irrigation.
Okay, the top-line numbers are massive, I'm not denying that. $4 billion is a massive influx of foreign currency. It represents about 15% of Egypt's non-oil exports. But when you lift the hood on those mechanics, the engine is running dangerously hot. Let's talk about the ultimate limitation, the absolute ceiling on this whole project: water poverty.
Okay, let's get into the water math.
The math is just unforgiving. Egypt relies almost entirely on the Nile. They have a fixed quota of 55.5 billion cubic meters of water annually. Now, distribute that across a population that just exceeded 110 million people.
Right, the per capita share drops.
Drastically. That puts the per capita water share at less than 600 cubic meters a year. To give you some global context, the United Nations defines the absolute water poverty line at 1,000 cubic meters per person.
So they are well under it.
Egypt is operating at nearly half the poverty line. So aggressively expanding physical acreage, literally expanding the footprint of things that need to drink, under these conditions is a ticking clock. And it's made worse by the fact that the current model suffers from massive systemic inefficiencies.
Inefficiencies like what, exactly?
Well, they are aggressively pushing for new land while wasting what they already grow. Look at tomatoes. They produce 6 to 7 million tons of tomatoes annually, making them a global heavyweight. Yet there is a staggering 25% post-harvest loss.
Ah, yes. I'm well aware of the tomato paradox.
It's more than a paradox. It's a structural failure. Because of weak cold chain infrastructure, literally a lack of refrigerated trucks and modern storage facilities, 1/4 of those tomatoes rot in the 100-degree heat before they ever reach a market or a processing plant.
It is a significant loss, I'll grant you that.
They are leaving hundreds of millions of dollars to rot in the sun. Relying on physical expansion into the desert rather than maximizing the value of what is already grown in the valley is, a highly unsustainable trajectory.
Look, I see why you emphasize the water ceiling and the inefficiencies, but let me give you a different perspective on how they're navigating global markets. Let's pull on that thread of citrus, because oranges are the crown jewel of their export market. Egypt's citrus export market is now worth roughly $1 billion annually on its own.
Which is huge.
Exactly. They produce about 5 million tons of citrus, and they are successfully exporting 2 million of that, and this perfectly illustrates the structural competitiveness I'm talking about. They didn't just stumble into the #1 spot. They strategically undercut Spain, who historically had an iron grip on the European and global citrus trade.
But wait, why were they able to undercut Spain?
Because Egypt engineered a system where their production costs are 25 to 35% lower. If you go to modern, reclaimed farms across Beira, Ismailia, or Minya, they aren't just planting trees haphazardly. They're achieving dense, highly managed yields of 20 tons per faidon.
Okay, but
And with that cost advantage, they systematically captured massive market share, not just in the EU, but across Russia and, critically, China, where demand spiked dramatically after 2019. This is a calculated economic maneuver. They looked at global supply chains, identified where European producers were rigid or expensive, and they flooded those exact channels with high-quality, lower-cost produce.
wait, I have to stop you there. You can't just brush past Spain's drop in production as if it was merely a pricing victory for Egypt. You're looking at agricultural markets and misinterpreting temporary climate anomalies as permanent structural shifts.
You think outcompeting Spain is just an anomaly?
Yes, Egypt beat Spain, but Spain's recent decline was heavily influenced by severe generational droughts that literally dried up reservoirs in Andalusia. I mean, it slashed Spanish production by up to 20% in some seasons. Add to that the fact that Spain is dealing with European labor laws, where high baseline labor costs exceed €12 an hour.
Which is exactly why Egypt has a structural advantage. Labor is a structural reality.
But the drought isn't. Egypt took advantage of a gap, absolutely, but it's a gap created by an external climate crisis, not necessarily superior Egyptian innovation. Furthermore, look at the other players on the board. Morocco produces 2.5 to 3 million tons of citrus, and they possess a permanent, unchangeable geographic advantage: proximity.
Sure, they are closer to Europe.
They are right across the Strait of Gibraltar. That drastically cuts their shipping cost and transit time to the EU. Then you have Turkey, right there in the Mediterranean, producing 4 to 5 million tons. Their recent lag in exports is largely tied to temporary political volatility and inflation affecting their traditional trading routes.
So you're saying it's just a matter of time before they bounce back?
Exactly. My point is, when Spain's climate stabilizes and when Turkey's political landscape settles down, Egypt's sheer volume and cheap labor advantage might not be enough to hold that #1 spot.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame the architecture of their market strategy very differently.
You are looking at these competitors and treating Egypt's market share as an isolated vulnerability, as if all their oranges are sitting in a basket waiting for Spain to recover.
Well, aren't they?
No, because Egypt's approach is actually deeply insulated by design. Think of their export strategy exactly like a highly diversified investment portfolio. They deliberately do not rely on a single buyer or a single region.
Okay, let's hear the breakdown.
If you look at the distribution, roughly 30% of their exports go to Arab countries, 25% go to the European Union, 20% to Russia and the Eurasia region, and the remainder is expanding heavily into Asia and Africa.
That is fairly spread out, yeah.
This deliberate mathematical spread is exactly what insulates the Egyptian citrus sector from the very political and climate shocks you just mentioned. If the European market tightens up because it rains in Spain again, it doesn't break the Egyptian economy. The Eurasian or Asian markets absorb the volume to balance the ledger.
Diversification is certainly a strength. But here's the friction point. Accessing those high-tier markets, particularly the European Union, requires a level of strict quality control. That brings us to my central concern. There is a massive discrepancy in Egypt right now between their high-end, export-facing technological successes and their macro-level domestic inefficiencies.
Let's talk about that high-end technology, because I think it completely counters the idea that Egypt is just running a raw volume play. You mentioned how notoriously strict the European market is.
Extremely strict.
Right. To get a piece of fruit into Germany or France, you have to prove exactly where it came from. Egypt adapted to this by implementing a highly sophisticated digital coding system across its export farms.
Ah, the digital passports.
Exactly. Every participating farm is essentially assigned a digital ID, a literal QR code system that tracks the entire life cycle of the crop. We are talking about tracking the specific type of pesticide used, the exact dates of spraying, the soil composition, and the precise harvest timelines.
So it's full traceability.
Full traceability. If you buy an Egyptian orange in a supermarket in Berlin, there is a digital trail linking it back to a specific tree in Bahira. This isn't just bureaucratic red tape. This builds immense institutional trust. In international trade, trust equals premium pricing. And they are pairing this digital data tracking with physical processing technology.
Are you going to bring up the frozen strawberries?
Yes. Look at the frozen strawberries. Egypt is now among the top 3 global exporters of frozen strawberries, generating up to $400 million annually. And they do this utilizing IQF, individual quick freezing technology.
Right, which freezes them almost instantly.
For those unfamiliar, IQF is a process that freezes each individual piece of fruit within minutes. Because it freezes so fast, it prevents large ice crystals from forming, which means it doesn't destroy the cellular walls of the strawberry. It locks in the color, the taste, and the nutritional value perfectly.
It is a great technology. I won't deny that.
By leveraging IQF, Egypt isn't just selling cheap fruit to produce aisles. They're acting as the primary supplier for massive, multinational bakery, yogurt, and juice industries across Belgium, Germany, and the UK. They are actively executing the single most vital economic motto in agriculture today: don't sell your crop raw.
Okay, I have to jump in here, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that this motto is being applied broadly enough to save the system. You highlight the frozen strawberries, and yes, the IQF technology and the early harvest window for strawberries in Cayubia are brilliant. It's a great case study.
It proves they can do it.
But I seize on that very motto, don't sell your crop raw, as the exact area where Egypt is failing on a macro level. The strawberries are the exception. They are not the rule.
How can you say they are the exception when the infrastructure is actively being rolled out?
Because the data shows us they are the exception. Let's go back to the tomatoes. As we established, Egypt is a global giant growing roughly 6 to 7 million tons. And yet they lose 25% of it to post-harvest decay.
Right, we covered the tomato loss.
I want the listener to really visualize this, though. We are talking about over 1.5 million tons of tomatoes turning to absolute mush in the back of open-air trucks because they don't have enough refrigerated transport or cold storage facilities near the farms. 1/4 of the crop gone.
It's an area for improvement. Definitely. Now, contrast this directly with Turkey. Turkey doesn't just export raw tomatoes, they process them. Turkey generates over $300 million annually just from exported tomato paste. Egypt has over 60 factories linked to tomato paste and concentrate, yet their processed export numbers pale in comparison to the sheer raw volume they lose to the sun every single year. The digital coding for EU oranges is fantastic, but until you fix the domestic cold chain that is bleeding 25% of your largest crops, the system is fundamentally inefficient.
See, I am not convinced by that line of reasoning at all, because you are looking at a massive, solvable opportunity and framing it as a fatal flaw.
A 25% loss is a pretty big flaw.
Yes, a 25% post-harvest loss in tomatoes is a steep inefficiency, but think about the incredible economic leverage that represents. In the current paradigm, if Egypt wants to increase agricultural revenue, they typically need to push further into the desert, reclaim more sand, and pump more water.
Exactly my point.
But right here, with the tomatoes, cutting that 25% loss down to, say, 10% through better supply chains would instantly add hundreds of millions of dollars in export value. and it wouldn't require a single extra drop of water. It wouldn't require a single new fedon of land.
But they haven't done it yet.
It is a clearly defined upside. Upgrading cold storage and logistics is a straightforward infrastructure play. Given the billings they have already successfully invested in agricultural roads and packing stations for the citrus market, expanding that to domestic crops is the logical next step. It's an easy win waiting to happen.
But that assumes they have the luxury of time to figure it out. And the water data strongly suggests they don't. The water ceiling doesn't care about logical next steps. This brings us to the 2030 horizon.
The government targets.
Yes, the government's stated goal is to reach 10 million tons of agricultural exports, generating $7 to $8 billion annually by the year 2030. That goal is fundamentally at odds with the mathematics of their water supply. You cannot double your export value purely by expanding acreage when you are capped at 55.5 billion cubic meters.
Nobody is denying the physical limits of the Nile.
But pushing deeper into the desert requires immense foundational water resources just to make the sand hold a root. Unless there is a total systemic pivot toward industrial processing, which extracts drastically more economic value per drop of water used, the current trajectory of physical expansion is environmentally unsustainable. You simply can't out-infrastructure a dry aquifer.
I agree that water is the existential variable here. But you are vastly underestimating the massive technological shift in water management that is already deployed on the ground. They aren't just pouring water onto sand and hoping for the best.
Well, I would hope not.
First, there is a massive transition away from the traditional flood irrigation used in the old Nile Delta. In the newly reclaimed desert lands, they strictly use precision drip irrigation and sprinkler systems. This transition alone is saving 20 to 30% of water usage. But more importantly, they have established over 100,000 agricultural greenhouses.
Okay, the greenhouse projects are significant. I'll acknowledge that.
They are a total game changer. A greenhouse creates a closed microclimate. It traps evaporation and drastically reduces the amount of water needed compared to open field farming. At the same time, because the environment is controlled, greenhouses can increase crop yield by up to 40%.
So you're getting more food for less water?
Exactly. You are getting more food for less water. Add to that the implementation of modern soil moisture sensors. Farmers now have technology that tells them exactly when a plant needs hydration at the root level rather than just watering on a schedule. They are using drones for targeted pesticide spraying, which cuts down on water volume mixed with chemicals. They are fundamentally redefining the ratio of water to yield. Every single drop is being mathematically optimized.
Optimization is vital. Using drip irrigation instead of flood irrigation is absolutely necessary. But even with optimization, if they successfully push toward that 10 million ton mark, we have to talk about where that sheer volume is meant to go.
Meaning the end consumer?
Yes, we have to talk about market saturation in Europe and the Middle East. And this is exactly where sub-Saharan Africa enters the conversation.
Oh, it's a massive frontier. The demographics there are undeniable. You have a booming population, rising incomes, and skyrocketing food demand. Africa presents a fascinating dilemma and an incredible opportunity for Egyptian agriculture.
But what kind of opportunity? That's the real question. With new trade agreements and infrastructural routes, like the Cape to Cairo road slowly coming online, Africa seems like the natural outlet.
Right. It connects them directly to massive new markets.
But here's the catch. Is sub-Saharan Africa simply going to be an easy dumping ground for raw, unprocessed Egyptian goods? Because if Egypt just uses Africa to offload millions of tons of raw oranges and raw onions, that just perpetuates the low-margin, high-water cost cycle. It's a trap.
You think they'll just dump raw produce?
I think it's a risk. As the African middle class grows, that market isn't just going to want raw produce. They're going to demand highly processed, value-added goods. The packaged foods, the juices, the tomato pastes that Egypt currently struggles to scale up domestically. If Egypt treats Africa as a release valve for raw volume, they completely miss the structural pivot they desperately need to survive their water constraints.
I think that is the defining question for the next decade of their economic policy. It's the pivot point. But if we look back at the totality of what we've unpacked today, my position stands firm. When you combine the massive strategic land reclamation in the desert, the rigorous implementation of digital coding to unlock premium European markets, and their aggressive, deliberate diversification across global buyers, The evidence points to a massive success.
I still see the vulnerabilities.
But Egypt has built a resilient, multi-billion-dollar economic engine. They have proven they can adapt to strict standards, they can scale physical infrastructure, and they can dominate specific global verticals, like citrus and frozen strawberries. The foundation for 2030 is already poured, and the technology is catching up to the ambition.
And my position remains that any foundation built on a severe water deficit is inherently precarious. The $4 billion export revenue is a triumph of effort, but the mechanics remain vulnerable.
Vulnerable to the climate, you mean?
And to their own infrastructure, until that 25% post-harvest loss in crops like tomatoes is effectively eliminated through proper cold chain logistics, and until the philosophy of don't sell your crop raw transitions from a niche success in the strawberry sector to the dominant macroeconomic strategy across all exports, Egypt is running against the clock. Volume is vanity, process value is sanity. They have to transition from a farming mindset to an industrial food processing mindset.
Yet despite our different angles on the sustainability of the acreage, we both clearly converge on that exact point. Technology, cold chain logistics, and industrial processing, and absolute adherence to squeezing maximum dollar value out of every single crop are the undeniable keys to Egypt's long-term prosperity as an agricultural exporter.
Completely agreed. The physical limits of the earth, and specifically the limits of the Nile, will eventually force that transition, whether the global market is ready for it or not.
It is a truly remarkable balancing act. We are watching a nation weigh explosive economic growth and global market capture against the absolute finite limits of its natural resources. There is certainly much more nuance to uncover in the ongoing data regarding how Egypt will navigate the road to its 2030 export goals.
Definitely a lot more to watch in the coming years.
Absolutely. But for now, think back to that satellite image we started with. The dark green of the irrigated valley is still pushing aggressively into the beige of the desert, rewriting the map day by day. The question that remains is simply, well, how long can it hold the line? Thank you for joining us on The Debate.